I'm so excited to have this conversation with Dr. Peter Liljedahl. He was my mentor last year as I implemented thinking classrooms into my asynchronous online classroom, and he's just been continued to be a great friend and ally. And so I'm super excited to dive into this conversation with him. A little bit about Dr. Peter Liljedahl. He's a professor of mathematics education in the Faculty of Education and an associate member of the Department of Mathematics at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Liljedahl is also the current president of the Canadian Mathematics Education Study Group, an international group for the psychology of mathematics education. He serves on several editorial boards. He has authored and co-authored 12 books, over 38 chapter books, 38 journal articles, and over 50 conference papers. Dr. Liljedahl is also a member of the executive of the British Columbia Mathematics Teachers Association and former co-editor of their flagship journal, Vector. He is a recent recipient of the Simolic Prize for Enhancement of Public Education in BC, as well as the Margaret Sinclair Memorial Award for Innovation and Excellence in Mathematics Education. Dr. Liljedahl is a former high school teacher of mathematics who has kept his research interests and activities close to the classroom. He consults regularly with schools, school districts, and ministries of education on issues of teaching and learning, assessment, and numeracy. His research interests include creativity, insight, and the discovery of mathematics in teaching and learning, the role that the AHA experience plays in student engagement and learning, the role that the affective domain on teaching and learning of mathematics, the development and changes in teacher beliefs, the professional growth of mathematics teachers, mathematical problem solving, the development and use of numeracy tasks as a resource for teaching, assessment, putting theory into practice, the student experience in adapting to a progressive classroom, studenting, the student's behavior in a learning situation, and building thinking classrooms. So let's dive right into our conversation with Dr. Liljedahl as he talks about the navigation tool he developed and how it helps focus the spotlight on learning. Using analogies of navigation and scientists, Dr. Liljedahl explains how the navigation tool puts the students in control of their learning and makes the teacher an ally in student learning. I'm super excited for this conversation. So here we go. Okay, good evening, and thank you, Dr. Peter Liljedahl, for joining me for third installment of my Lit Review. This is a podcast diving into a little bit of how to assess in a thinking classroom.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
So with the formative assessment, I've done a lot of looking and research, and of course there's overwhelming amounts of research that say formative assessment is really what promotes learning, but it's been a bit of a stumbling block for me when I was in the classroom and even at eBus doing online stuff, because a lot of what I know is all about summative assessment, and so you end up sort of falling back on that, not knowing sort of how to do formative assessment well and what tools to use to do formative assessment, and running into problems in class. I can remember one particular occasion where I would want to give feedback to somebody and they didn't want to receive the feedback because they felt it was singling them out. Right. And so you've come up with a navigation tool as part of your thinking classroom practices. Can you tell me about that?
Sure. So first of all, if we backtrack onto formative assessment and think about what is its intention, like what is the purpose of it? And for me, I landed very squarely in that formative assessment is supposed to inform learning. And you mentioned this as well, but that's not always, we can't take that for granted, because there is literature out there that talks about formative assessment as informing teaching. And I suspect that there is also a large number of people who are operating on the assumption that formative assessment informs teaching. So it's that informal assessment that I do on the day-to-day basis that helps inform what the students still need to learn. But when we make that turn away from teaching to learning, what actually can formative assessment do for us? Now, for me, when I started down that journey, I latched on very squarely. Well, before that, I had a couple of epiphanies in my work on formative assessment. One of the first was that what we think informs learning is actually not the same thing as actually informs learning. We, like you said, we tend to lean into summative, and we think that I can just use summative assessment in place of formative assessment. So for example, I can do a quiz that doesn't count for marks, or I can do a test that doesn't count for marks. And then I can give the exact same feedback as I would if it was like, I would mark it like a test or a quiz and give that back and think that that somehow informs learning. We found that it didn't. We found that students actually have a very tough time extracting information from those sorts of summative instruments in ways that is useful for their learning. So we have to shift. We have to shift. Like, if it's supposed to inform learning, then we have to start thinking about what is the kind of information that can actually get through to a learner, that a learner can make use of. And then the navigation instrument emerged. And it emerged as a product of me leaning heavily into the metaphor of navigation, which is that in order to be able to navigate, we need to know where we are and where we're going. And fundamentally, this is the anchor of these navigation tools, is how do we help students understand where they are, and how do we help them understand where they're going? And you need actually both of those pieces of information in order for a student to be able to start to navigate their own learning. So where they are is what they currently know, and where they're going is the potential spaces that they can come to know. And that's the tricky part. How do we help students know what they don't know? And that's, I think, what the navigation instrument does by and large, is help students know what they don't know.
Yeah, because one of the things I've found in, because I am using the navigation tool in my Workplace Math 11 course, and part of the reflection questions is, what do you need to do to get better at this? Or what's next in your learning? And the students are very generic in their responses. Often they refer to the title of the next chapter, or, I need to, work harder, or something like this.
I need to do my homework, and I need to review my notes.
So how does this tool really help students then figure out where they are and where they need to go?
So, okay, so without visuals, this is a little bit tricky to explain, but it's, first of all, it also leans heavily into outcomes-based assessment. So the first thing we need to do is we need to take the stuff that students are learning, and that students by and large see as just a pile of stuff. They can't really discern the differences. We as teachers have really clear views of what it is we're teaching, but we also have a very different perspective on what students are doing and what we're teaching. I use a metaphor that we are like, the students are like mice in a maze. Mm-hmm. They're running around in this maze, and they're peeking around corners trying to see have I been down this corridor before? This is the direction we're going? Are we going over here? I'm not sure where the exit is. I'm not even sure if this is where we came from. So they're the mice in the maze, and they're navigating themselves through the maze. The teacher, from us, our perspective, we're like the scientist in the lab coat with the clipboard standing above the maze looking down. We have such a clear view of the curriculum. We can see over the horizon, and we can see where the students are within this curriculum. The students can't see that. They're still in the maze. So this is why when we were giving feedback back, the students would say generic things like the next chapter or I need to work harder. Because how do you actually not say what to do next if you're inside of a maze? It's tricky. So what the navigation instrument does is it takes this curriculum and it builds a map for the students so that they can get out of the maze and they can stand aside the scientist and look down and see the landscape of the curriculum. So we do this by taking curriculum and dividing it in two different ways. The first is by outcomes. We can say outcomes. So we'll take a unit on whatever the unit is and we'll divide it into its sub-units, right? So we'll take a unit on fractions. The unit on fraction is a combination of subtopics. It's adding and subtracting fractions. It's multiplying and dividing fractions. It's adding and subtracting mixed fractions, and so on and so forth. So these are subtopics that exist within the larger topic of fractions. So we first parse curriculum into those categories, and then we parse it further, because adding fractions comes in different flavors, right? We can add fractions with a common denominator. We can add fractions where the denominator of one is a multiple of the other. We can add fractions where the two fractions are completely distinct or relatively prime. The two denominators are relatively prime. Each of these requires a different level of competency for the student to be able to achieve. So we can't just have one outcome that says adding fractions. Because adding fractions actually comes in multiple flavors, right? We have adding fractions with common denominator, adding fractions with, we can say, familiar denominators, and adding fractions with different denominators. And what's interesting about this parsing, so in my work, we see it as two-dimensional, right? So we have a list, we have the rows are the different outcomes, and the columns are the different competency levels at each outcome, we could say. And what's interesting about these is that they're backwards compatible. If a student can do that third level of adding fractions, which is where the denominators are different, they just also prove that they can do the previous two levels. So it's this sort of two-dimensional map. And the students can use that now. They can pinpoint very clearly where they are on the map, what they can do, and they can also pinpoint very clearly and name what is it that they're still working on, what they can't yet do, where they're going.
Okay. And you looked into as well some of these columns and some terminology on what they needed to be called, and that had an effect on the students. And I caught you there too. I think you just referred to the third column, and so can you tell me more about that and how that came to be, you know, the importance of the three columns and the names that we put on those columns?
Right. So if we were using these strictly for summative assessment or for our own edification, it doesn't matter what we call them, right? But when we're feeding this information back to the students, it turns out that what we call the columns makes a difference. So some of the names of these three columns that we found worked really well are things like easy, medium, and hard. Now the students like that. It's really clear to them. The teachers were a little bit uncomfortable, so we eventually shifted to basic, intermediate, advanced. Thank you, because we've actually shifted the discourse since then. One of the things that the kids really, really like is when we call them mild, medium, spicy.
Oh yeah.
They love that one, and the teachers are really tapping into that with icons of chili peppers and so on. So mild, medium, spicy, or first, next, then is also turning out to be quite popular with the students and effective with the students. The ones that didn't work were things like novice, intermediate, expert, developing, proficient, things like this. So these sorts of modifiers. And what we found were the difference between them were that the modifiers, the labels that talked about the mathematics, were absolutely okay, and the modifiers that talked about the students were not okay. So, and ironically, those are the modifiers we use here in BC, modifiers that talk about the students. And this taps really closely into the growth mindset, which is that students who have a fixed mindset tend to take feedback as a description of who they are rather than a description of where they are. So when we're then compounding this problem by having language that talks about who they are, it just makes the problem more challenging, that the students with a fixed mindset are really becoming entrenched in that fixed mindset. Whereas if we start using language of where they are, first, next, then, mild, medium, spicy, basic, intermediate, advanced, right? Like when we're talking about the mathematics, it's less about labeling the students. And then, so it doesn't promote fixed mindset. We still have to do other things to get them into that growth mindset, but at least we're not making it worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that goes really far, I guess, explaining why I had that difficulty with the student shared with you earlier that didn't want to have the feedback because they felt they were being pointed out and singled out and felt maybe even attacked from their point of view, that they were somehow less than, and other people could see we were talking. And so,
but the mild, medium, spicy, the kids love that. Every kid wants to get to spicy.
Right on. Now, you talked as well about this tool and it needing to be timely. It was one of the things that sort of, because this tool has been a bit of a game changer for me when it comes to how to do things and doing it in that timely fashion. And you talked a little bit about in doing your research, as soon as they were sort of unengaged or had finished, and it took, I think you were talking about over the weekend, the teacher works really hard, comes back, and really thinks they've done a good job. And I've been there before where I would actually stay up late that night marking a test, and I'd hit in my automatic grade book, send a progress update to all the parents, and I felt very proud that I was, an excellent teacher, and now I just feel embarrassed that that's, the way that I did things, and thinking I was being efficient and really good with it. And so can you tell me more about the timeliness and how that impacts the student?
Right. So we know this. We know that formative feedback needs to be timely and specific. And we've just finished talking a lot about the specificity of it. But now let's talk about this timeliness. And we tend to think that timely means a quick turnaround, like I collect it on Friday, I have it back on Monday. Or if I collect it on Wednesday, if I can get it back on Thursday, that's awesome. That's timely. And what we're finding is that that's not timely enough. And I think we've all had that experience where we work really hard on something, we return it, and the students don't even look at it.
Yeah.
We've worked really hard at providing all this feedback. And some of the literature says that, well, that's because if there's a mark on it, they just focus on the mark. But even if we take the mark off, if they have cognitively moved beyond where they were, they don't care about the feedback anymore. So we have two choices with that. One is we have to re-engage the mind at the time that the feedback, just prior to the feedback coming, or we have to get that feedback back to them while they're still engaged in the activity to begin with. But then, of course, that sets up a situation that is almost unattainable. There's no way that we as teachers can provide that instant and specific feedback to every student every moment of every day. So this is why this navigation instrument is so powerful, because the students can use it for self-assessment in a very data-driven way that allows them to get all of that feedback immediately while they're still engaged. In fact, filling out the navigation tool is part of the process, so they're cognitively engaged in the process and affectively engaged. So that feedback is coming back at a time when they are still engaged with the mathematics. And that makes all the difference.
Okay, that helps them to see where they're at and the specific things they need to do because they're already engaged in that thinking. Okay. And you had some pretty remarkable results in using this tool and how it changed test scores.
Yeah. So we saw in 60% of the students, we saw an immediate 20% improvement. And in many ways, that's an underreporting. It's such a massive change and such a massive improvement that it's almost unbelievable. But we've even seen reports that are well higher than that, like 50% improvements. And it's something like, I've been in this education business a long time. How many times have you encountered something that can make a 20% improvement almost overnight in the achievement of the majority of your students, right? Like it's rare. And what we found was effective formative assessment has a way bigger impact on student performance on tests than preparation for the test. Like if we're rehearsing the test and working on preparing for the test and reviewing, that doesn't have as big an impact as effective formative assessment.
Now, is that because they're essentially, when you're practicing that test and going over the repetition of it, you're still really trying to memorize and not necessarily understand the material, which eventually evaporates if you're not using it. Whereas here, they know discreetly this is the part that I need to focus on, and that's where they gain a greater understanding in that particular area.
I definitely think that's part of it. But I think the greater part of it is rehearsing for a test. You're just getting better at running the maze, but you're still in the maze, right? And I think what the formative assessment does is it lifts them out of the maze. They just have a totally different perspective. They know where they can put their energy and their focus, and they understand how they can navigate their learning in this space. And now and then the other interesting thing is when the formative assessment is effective that way, the students start to focus on learning. Mm-hmm. But test prep is focused on getting a good mark. And those are two totally different things, right? A focus on getting a mark is not the same as focusing on learning. If you focus on learning, a mark is a byproduct, but it is possible to focus on just your marks without actually attending to learning. And I think that's the big difference. And that shift in formative assessment just gives them that perspective of the maze so that they can actually participate in the learning.
Yeah. And so then, because we're still required to report numbers and letter grades and things right now, so I mean, we can't just forget about summative assessment. It needs to be part of the equation, and focusing more on the formative assessment gives some balance to it, and I can see how it helps students understand where they're at and therefore increases the test scores. And so when it comes to the summative assessment, you've given some examples in the book about some skydiving, and how when you look at those examples, the one Abigail it is who starts off really low and climbs, and then sort of levels off at a high performance, which, is typical of most learners. And then there's, I think it's Ben after that, something happens, starts off really high, knows lots of stuff, and then he, falls off somewhere and he ends up finishing low. And then the third student, Charlotte. Yeah. And who's, hit and miss, and it's, sometimes really, really hot and sometimes really cold. But interesting when you take a look at what you describe as a point gathering paradigm, those three students are the same. They all average out. And then you get into this talking about this data gathering paradigm and how these assessment stories are very, very different for each of these students. Can you dive into that a little bit?
Sure. So this idea of the parachute packing, that's a metaphor that came from Ken O'Connor. But it's this idea that we all understand at an innate level that a student who starts off low, improves, and now is performing high has a very different learner profile than someone who's up and down, or someone who starts high and drops and finishes low. That we can have these different learner profiles, and they actually mean that these students are different. And what the point gathering paradigm does is it says it doesn't care. It doesn't care where the points come from. And the point gathering paradigm is a paradigm we all grew up with in the 20th century. It's that paradigm where, okay, you have a quiz on Friday, 15 points up for grabs. Let's see how many points you get. And then there's a big unit test next week, 50 points up for grabs. Let's see how many points you get. And then at report card time, we add up how many points you got, and we divide by how many points you could have got. And that kind of churns out a percentage, and we can do some scaling on that. But the point is that we don't really care where the points come from, right? We don't care if all the points come at the end or all the points come at the beginning, or they're a little bit scattered all over the place. A point's a point, and a lost point is forever a lost point, right? And the story of Abigail is so reflective of what education is actually supposed to achieve. The students aren't supposed to know stuff early on. So if we give them a pre-test or we give them a test on the second day of a unit and they don't do well, good. They're not supposed to know how to do this stuff. They're supposed to learn. And we're supposed to facilitate that learning through our teaching. And when that happens, it needs to be celebrated. So a student who starts out low or doesn't know things or underperforms or doesn't perform at all, and then improves in their performance, and in the end on that unit test really nails the assessment, deserves to get absolute full credit for all the learning they have achieved, and they deserve to be relieved of the early not knowing. Like, who cares if they didn't know how to do this at the beginning of April? At the end of April, they know how to do it. And that's all that matters. And this is what the data gathering paradigm says, which is, if we look at this as data, then the data tells us that Abigail didn't know something at the beginning. She has done what she's supposed to. She has learned, and now she has mastered it. And she needs to be given full credit for that. And in the data gathering paradigm, we can do that. The data is telling us that she has mastered it. We can give her full credit. The point gathering paradigm says, yeah, but she lost those points at the beginning of April, and she lost a bunch in the middle of April, and those are still there, and that means that she's not perfect.
Well, that's really interesting, because I think maybe the kindergarten teachers have that figured out, because at the end of the year, when you can count to 100, most kindergartners don't go in being able to count to 100, but yet we celebrate at the end, or on 100's day, like, here we are, you can count to 100, and you can do it, and they forget about all the stuff that they couldn't do. And so that's an interesting point, and I wonder why, when it comes to high school teachers, we sort of lose out on that, and start.
Well, I don't think it's just high school teachers. I think it's endemic within the system. I think that the primary teachers operate much more in a developmental model, but once we get into report cards in grade 3 or 4 and 5, we get a little bit obsessed with these points, especially in mathematics, because. And I think a large part because that's how we were assessed. And it's this idea of, can we earn points? Can we earn points? How do we earn points? And then these points have become the currency upon which math practice is built. There's some easy points, we'll call that homework. And then there's some gentle points, we'll call those quizzes. And then there's some harder points, and we'll call those tests. And let's see how many points you get.
And so you mentioned in the book about the data gathering paradigm and how it's sort of gentler on students because it sort of rewards them or notices the fact that they've done the learning in the end. And you talk about this correspondence in data between products and observations and conversations. And so how did you sort of come up with that? That to me too is moving away from the sort of strict, it's a test and here's the points, and it allows me more flexibility to make observations and have conversations with people to say, I can see that you can do this, and I don't know why you didn't do well on your test today, but and I guess in that way, in some of the conversations I've been having with students recently, they really appreciate let's get this figured out together. Like, don't worry about your test score. If you bomb it, we'll do something else to figure out what you know. And it just sort of seems to relieve a whole bunch of anxiety.
Yeah. So, first of all, there is this, you talked about this data gathering as being more gentle on students. And I think this comes back to what we were just talking about, the difference between formative and summative assessment, and how formative assessment really promotes learning, and summative assessment in the traditional way, in the 20th century way, really promotes just mark gathering. What outcomes-based assessment or data gathering assessment does, and I think the reason it's gentle is because it doesn't care about your points. It doesn't care about your mark. A mark is a byproduct in this system. What it cares about is your learning.
Yeah.
And whereas a point gathering is really just where are the points. And it can be a bit harsh, and it creates something I call the tyranny of objectivity. But this data gathering has this gentleness because it cares about the learning. I don't care if you couldn't do it at the beginning. I care that you can do it now. I don't care if you can't do it right now. We have more time for you to show me. So, and that feeds into this evidence triangle of product, observation, and conversation. And where that came from me was, I've spent a lot of time in the last many years working with teachers in Ontario. And in Ontario, this is a big deal. So for a very long time, their student success document talks about evidence of learning, and that we need to be triangulating our data. because data is very one-dimensional and students are not. They're multi-dimensional, and we need to access what it is that because the purpose of reporting is to actually output an accurate measure, we'll call it, of what this student has learned, right? Unless you're in the 20th century, then our goal is to output how many points they collected, which is really scorekeeping.
Scorekeeping, thank you.
Yeah. So we're actually trying to, in a outcomes-based or data gathering paradigm, we're trying to output the truth. That's what we're trying to output. And so we need to look at a wider set of data, this idea that data comes from different sources. And some students are just much better at demonstrating their learning, and that's what we're after. We're trying to get at their learning. And sometimes a test can show learning, and sometimes it can't. And if it can't, then we need to have a conversation, or we need to have an observation. And these are just different ways that we can get at the data. And there's actually, what's interesting is when you interview, because I had a doctoral student do this, she studied oral assessment versus written assessment, and she studied it in different geographic locations. So she studied it in places like Canada, where our tradition is written assessment. And then she studied it through people who work and live in places like Italy and Germany and Eastern Europe, where there's a strong tradition of oral assessment. And the people who have the people who have grown up in an oral assessment tradition will tell you, you can't actually measure understanding and learning within a written test. You can only measure it through conversation orally. A test shows you skills. That's it. We need the verbal, that oral, that observation, that conversation in order to actually see what a student understands and has learned. And people in Canada who have grown up in a product environment, test writing environment, we have, I think, mistakenly believed that a test can somehow accurately demonstrate what a student has learned. It demonstrates what a student can do, but does it fully capture the nuances of learning and understanding? And this is what Ontario's been trying to get at for years. Manitoba's been working at this as well, and so is Saskatchewan. So this idea that data comes in from more than one source is really, really important.
And then you kind of get into using that same navigation map that we talked about for the formative assessment, and students kind of get used to that. And then as a teacher, using that to inform your summative assessment.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found really interesting here is when you talked about, what shows mastery and how the students talk to you about, if they get something wrong, they don't actually have the skills. Like they'll just stare at the blank paper and, they'll go home with it and they don't know what to do. But if they've got help with it, or if they, made a silly mistake, they actually have the tools to maybe go and find another video or try another question and eventually figure it out on their own. So that really struck me as a sort of a powerful way to really help guide students to even better learning.
Yeah. And I don't think it just guides students, it also guides teachers, because for how long have we thought that you just have to study harder and review your notes, and then you will miraculously learn how to do the things you don't know how to do. Mm-hmm. That kind of thinking negates the value of a teacher in many ways, right? Like, we bring value to the environment. Our value is that we help students go from places that they don't know to places that they do know. And so it was the students who kind of taught this to us, that they were the ones who said, if you don't know how to do something, sitting at home and grinding away at that isn't going to work. We need to get help. You turn your X's into H's. You turn your can't do it to help. So you come and talk to the teacher or a classmate, but you get help on the things you don't know how to do. Once you've gotten help, and you still maybe are fumbling, making silly mistakes or so on, but at least now you have a toehold and you can actually start to work on this on your own. So the students taught us that you turn your X's into H's, and then you turn your H's into check marks. But it's too much to ask to try to go from an X to a check mark.
Yeah, and I can just see how that would be really liberating as a student, and instead of the traditional math classroom that I remember where, it's the big X's always and always focusing on the things you couldn't do. And here, just it seems like a really, I'd said gentle, which doesn't mean less rigorous,
No.
but gentler on the emotions and treating each student more as an individual and focusing on the strengths as opposed to what they can't do either early on or as they continue to learn.
Right, and it also focuses on that developmental idea that how do we actually move a student from what they can't do to what they can do, rather than just keep score of what they can and can't do, right? So it's gentle in that idea that it's developmental. We're trying to move you along. We're not just scorekeeping here.
Yeah, and I suppose when students see that you're a coach and you're trying to help them move along and not trying to hold them back or somehow record what they can't do, then we're seeing a greater level of engagement and a greater level of motivation, which in and of itself must turn into better grades and better performance.
Right, but those grades are now a byproduct of a process that is actually focused on learning. And one of the things that's interesting is the prevalence of the word yet. Right. So I don't know how to do this yet, which is very different from I lost marks there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's once a mark is lost, it's lost. But in a data gathering paradigm, it's I don't know how to do this yet, but I think I can get there. And when I do, I'm going to show the teacher, and then I'm going to get credit for that.
Yeah. Because I have lots of students come to me too that, lots of my grade 12 students are, wanting to get into university and wanting to get their grades up as high as they can. And, can I redo that quiz, to get 2% more, and can I hand in something for bonus marks? And I find with this, it just sort of eliminates all of that, right? Because even the students become focused on their learning, which as you say, is a byproduct, and it translates into higher grades automatically.
Yeah, and I've been in classrooms where I'm listening to grade 12 students, and they're not talking about how to get bonus marks. They're talking about which learning they yet have to evidence. And they know that if they can evidence it all, they're going to get a really high mark. And that makes things just so easy for them. Yeah. It isn't a game that they have no control over now. Think about that feeling where the destiny of me getting into university lies in your hands as the teacher rather than in my hands as the learner, right? Coming and asking you if I can do a retest, coming and asking you if I can have bonus marks, coming and disputing the marking of an exam. That entire destiny of my future lies in your hands as the teacher. Whereas in this data gathering perception or paradigm, that destiny lies in my hands. It's entirely in the student's hands. If I can just learn this, if I can demonstrate that I've learned it, I get the marks. But that's up to me, not up to you.
So that sounds like it can really just only help to build a relationship between a teacher and student.
Oh, yeah.
Rather than, butting heads and the teacher holding me back and being mad at the teacher. It really promotes the student taking responsibility for themselves, saying, hey, I can do this and it's up to me.
Yeah, I think what it does is it puts the teacher on the same side of the curriculum as the students. So it's me and you against the curriculum. Whereas point gathering in many ways puts a test between the students and the teacher.
Yeah. So it seems all this stuff that we've been talking about tonight really, when I look at, my desire to use assessment to support student success and well-being, it seems like this navigation tool really is the key, along with this paradigm shift from gathering points to how do I gather data about what the student knows and how do I get closer to the truth about what they really know, stripping away their anxiety from doing tests and things like that so that they can show what they know.
Yeah. And these two, and the nice thing about the formative assessment work we did is that it then became, as you mentioned, the tool by which we record where their learning is. So we don't have to have two separate things running. Our formative assessment structure is also our summative assessment structure. And the students are participating in this through their formative assessment so that there's this really nice meshing of the two types of assessment.
Excellent. Well, it's been great talking with you tonight. I appreciate you taking the time to support me, and looking forward to when you're up here face-to-face with us in Vanderhoof.
Yeah, that won't be long. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks for the great conversation.
What an incredible conversation with Dr. Peter Liljedahl, author of Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics, grades K to 12, 14 teaching practices for enhancing learning. What a transformative experience I've had reading through that book and having Dr. Liljedahl mentor me, and this conversation that we've just had. Like I say, the navigation map has been such a game changer for me, giving me a tool to really turn that formative assessment into summative assessment and look for evidence of learning, which now the grade becomes that byproduct of the learning. And what I love most about this, and what I didn't realize in the past, was how my assessment practices were detrimental to kids. And when I look at Michael Fullen and how he shows the disengagement of students from kindergarten, through to grade 9 and 10, and then it starts to climb back up a little bit again as they go through grades 11 and 12, but a real disengagement with school. And well, why is that? And I've become a firm believer now that our assessment practices is one of those things that just beats kids up. Why would you bother trying when the point's gone? So at some point you're never going to catch up, so why bother trying? And it just takes all the enthusiasm and joy out of it. So how do we put those things back in? Well, we put them back in putting them in charge, letting them be in control. I'm no longer standing between them and the test and them and the university. I'm on their side, an ally against the curriculum. And this kind of assessment just shows me that we can do this, and it really just helps to support student success and well-being. And that's exactly what I was looking for. So thank you so much to Dr. Peter Liljedahl and all of the hard work he's done and the research that he's put in. Just an incredible person, and I've just learned so much. Thank you.